Hi everyone, welcome to the November 17th edition of the TimeformUS Pacecast. I'm David Aragon, and I'll be joined in just a moment by my co-host, Craig Mulkowski. This week on the podcast, we're going to take a look back at last weekend's racing from around the country, though really just focusing on three circuits, California, New York, and Kentucky, where most of the major racing took place. A bit of a lull after last weekend's Breeders' Cup card, which I don't think any of us really minded because that last weekend was so stacked with stakes action at Keeneland that it's nice to get a little bit of a break after that. But we're going to discuss the few stakes races that took place around the country, as well as some impressive maiden and allowance performances that are worth following, including some 2-year-olds that I think will make their presence felt maybe when they turn 3 next year. And let's start with those 2-year-olds, as we're going to begin actually out in California this week at Del Mar. And they ran a couple of stakes races for 2-year-olds there, the Bob Hope and the Desi Arnaz. Let's start with the Bob Hope on Sunday. This was a grade 3 event going 7 furlongs. And Craig, I've got to say, I was pretty impressed by this 2-year-old performance from Red Flag for John Sheriffs. This one seems like he's got some ability.
Yeah, he sure does. I mean, it's hard not to be impressed by that. He got a 1:14 TimeformUS speed figure for the win. It was just his third lifetime start. And looking at his past performances, you had to be a little perplexed seeing that he just didn't run much at all on dirt his first time out. And then when moved to the turf second time, he had that winning effort with a 91 speed figure. But John Sheriffs knows what he's doing. So putting him back on dirt was probably a very positive sign that it was more a fact he wasn't cranked up to win first out, as so often Sheriff's horses are, and that he was going to run a big one, and he sure did. Now, I'll be the first to say I think he got a very favorable trip in behind what was a hot pace. This is a race I want to mention. I'm still hand timing races at Del Mar, and I definitely think the official times were not in the were definitely faster than the time of the race was actually faster than the official times. So part of that's the big reason for the big figure, if people are wondering. But he sat off of a pretty wicked speed duel up front and was able to just take over and look very good doing it. And you had hinted on the forecast that maybe these, we'd seen a lot of weak stakes races out in California from a figure perspective. And you mentioned that maybe we were going to start seeing the good ones. And I think we did here. And in the other 2-year-old stakes we're going to talk about later as well.
Yeah, I was kind of saying that as a hopeful proposition because we hadn't seen a whole lot of quality in the stakes races so far in California. And you would just imagine there were some better horses waiting in the woodwork. And that was certainly the case with Red Flag. I've got to say, I thought he ran pretty well within the context of the race. I mean, you had pretty much 4 horses dueling for the lead up front, and he was 4 wide in that scuffle up front, and he put away those 3 other speeds, and those horses that he was dueling with, they actually finished 4th, 5th, and 6th, the last 3 positions, and a couple horses that were farther back, they picked up the pieces for 2nd and 3rd. So, I mean, he was the only horse that was involved in that pace to really finish off the race. He obviously had never run this well before, though if you watch his first couple of starts, he had trouble getting out of the gate both times, and that was clearly not an issue in this race. So whatever they did, whatever work at the gate John Sheriffs did between those first 2 starts in this race obviously worked because he was able to get out this time and show that natural speed and that true talent that he really possesses. He's by Tamarcuz. We haven't seen too many Tamarcuzes run yet, at least not really quality stakes level ones, so I don't really know what these horses are ultimately going to want to do, whether he can stretch out or not. Immediately on the dam side, he's a half-brother to Surrender Now, who was a turf sprinter for, I believe, Peter Miller. So that would lead you to believe Shorter could be better. But if you go deeper in his female family, there's actually a lot of quality with this horse going back to the 2nd generation. His dam is out of a daughter of Glowing, or his 2nd dam, I should say, is out of a daughter of Glowing Tribute. It's a really strong family. You've got some dirt horses in that family. So we'll see what this one can do moving forward, but I thought this was a pretty impressive performance.
Yeah, it did. And as far as the trip goes, I mean, you're right. It wasn't an easy trip for him. I think I was more getting at that it was a very tough trip for the others in that duel. And it's kind of shown with our figures where Spielberg, who was back and forth, actually got a 104, which was a good 9 points higher than the runner-up, who just kind of sucked up in the 2nd. And even the same for the 3rd finisher, who was a little bit closer, but he only wound up with a 99. So I think it was a pretty strong effort, but particularly from the winner. I mean, it's a huge gap in the numbers to everybody else, and he's the one that I would want to see come back.
We saw a pretty similar scenario on Saturday in the Desi Arnaz for the 2-year-old fillies as a horse that had broken its maiden going 5.5 furlongs on the turf, switched to the dirt for this stakes race and took a huge step forward. And Craig, this is one that you saw coming a little bit as you liked Astute to upset the heavily bet Bob Bapford favorite Private Mission. And those two certainly put on a show in the early going. They really went at it through the first half mile, but Private Mission was off the bridle coming to the top of the stretch, and Astute just took over and powered away to an impressive victory looking a lot like Red Flag the day after.
Yeah, that was an impressive performance. She certainly took to the dirt, and I think it'd be hard to argue she's probably better on dirt. I mean, I know it's early in her career and she won both, but just visually watching how she handled the surface, she looked so much better on Saturday than she did first time out, even winning that race on turf. She was kind of struggling at the end, but just a huge effort. She got a 110 TimeformUS speed figure, and kind of a similar scenario where you had to go back to fourth to get the second best figure, and that was Private Mission, who got a 102 as part of that duel before backing out. And she actually improved her figure first time out. But as we talk about often on our shows with these 2-year-olds, they're just constantly changing. I think on Twitter I mentioned it's kind of like betting on high school football games, because these aren't what we're going to see as 3 and 4-year-olds, and they're just changing so rapidly that it's really hard to bet them just based on speed figures. You got to do things like you do where you analyze pedigree, you got to watch trips, and you got to know the trainers. And Astute just looked like one that was going to pop a big one to me, and she certainly did. But I'll be the first to admit a 110 surprised me. But looking at the race and the way she drew off, it's not surprising. Just going in, that's a pretty big jump of 15 points, but she earned every bit of it.
Well, with both of these 2-year-olds, Red Flag and Astute, we're dealing with a couple of trainers in John Sheriffs and Richard Mandela who don't always crank them up to win first time out. They can bring them along slowly. They ran those horses on turf, maybe just because those were the spots that came up, maybe because they needed that education. And I think it just stood to reason that they could take that step forward with a little more racing experience, just because that's how those barns bring those horses along. So this one took a big step forward. As you pointed out in the forecast last week, she's got a big dirt pedigree on the dam side. She's a half sister to Classic Point, who was a multiple stakes winning sprinter. There's further dirt going deeper in the female family. So this is one that can certainly continue to improve. It's funny, both of these horses are from that Speightstown sire line, and Speightstown is just so versatile, getting horses that can run on dirt and turf, that can go short and long. So it'll just be kind of fascinating to see how these horses develop moving forward. Before we go on with the Del Mar races, though, Craig, I do have one question for you. I only watched a limited number of races on the dirt at Del Mar last week, but in the races that I did watch, it seemed like you didn't want to be right down on the rail. You saw a lot of these horses that were winning or that were running well out in the middle of the track, and I just wondered if you noticed that when you're doing the figures, or if you saw anything that would corroborate that.
I mean, I noticed the same thing watching the races. As far as making the figures, I mean, it turned out it wasn't a huge factor. That's not something we capture in our bias ratings. We're more looking for speed or closer, not so much inside or outside, because that's just something I think you have to do visually. It would be very tough to do with the data that we're given these days. Maybe something in the future, but I would recommend people go back and watch. I haven't looked closely enough to sit here and say it was a bad rail, because I'm not sure, but it's always, for me, interesting to go back and sometimes just focus on only the horses that are on the rail and see how they perform figure-wise after the fact. And if I see a whole bunch of horses regress that were on the rail, or the majority, then I'm going to give that a lot more credence than I do just watching. So definitely something to look for, but I don't want to give an opinion on it because I just don't know. I didn't watch enough.
And as I mentioned at the top, we're going to talk about some allowance races that just are notable speed figures from last weekend in the absence of some stakes racing that would typically push these races out of our lineup. And the highest speed figure that we saw in Southern California last weekend was in a Friday allowance race on the turf, earned by Musawat, a horse that was a big price in this race. He paid $38, I think. He had some trouble finding his stride, I would say, since coming to this country last year for Mike Pipey, but it seems like he's starting to put it all together now. And this was just a fun race to watch, a really competitive race and kind of a wild finish as you had 3 horses hit the wire together.
Yeah, and honestly, I think this was a big effort from him. I mean, it was a really slow pace. We have it coded in blue. But I mean, these horses were flying home. Make no mistake, this isn't one of these pace upgrade races where it's on turf and the pace was so slow that I actually upgraded the overall figure while leaving the final time figure low. The final time figure was actually still a 111 off that very slow pace. So they were flying. He was not up front. He was able to run down a horse that was in front of him, Cali Caliente, who was the 8-5 favorite in a tight finish. But despite his odds, I don't think there was anything fluky about this at all. And it could just be that he's coming into his own as a fully mature 6-year-old. And that 117 is totally legit, in my opinion. And there's some pretty good horses in this field. It's not like he beat a bunch of nobodies. There's horses who we've talked about in stakes several times throughout the year. I mean, it is Southern California, so it's a little bit weaker than what we see on the East Coast in grass. But like I said, he wasn't beating just some slouches in here.
No, he's had kind of a funny career, Musawat. He was in Dubai for a while. I think that's actually well, he started his career in England. He was campaigned in Dubai for a couple seasons. He was actually fourth in the Godolphin Mile back in 2018. So he could run on the dirt as well, but they've really focused on running on the turf in this country. And he's now had a couple of victories. One came all the way back in January, but this other one last Friday at Del Mar looked pretty good. Certainly the best effort he's put forth so far. As you said, there was some quality in this field, but it seems like this was almost like a bit of a changing of the guard race, because the three horses that really had the biggest credentials coming in were actually the last three across the wire: Untamed Domain, Cleopatra Strike, and Grey Magician. They just didn't show up. And Cleopatra Strike, I just think it shows how tough this game can be sometimes, because we have been talking about him as a contender in graded stakes races for it feels like the better part of the past year, and it seems like he's just gone the wrong way recently. He was not competitive in this race.
Yeah, and that's just something. I mean, we've talked about the California turf racing. These moves, for example, I mean, if Musawat turns up in a stakes race last time, I'm not going to consider it a big class jump like I would at some other places, because there's just not that big a difference. So horses move back and forth between these races all the time, and horses dropping out of stakes races don't always get the job done. And we've seen plenty of allowance winners jump up into graded stakes and win.
Wrapping up the action at Del Mar from this week, we're going to go to Saturday to discuss another allowance race. This was the sixth race of that day. This one, we saw a pretty promising 3-year-old in Kiss Today Goodbye. This is a horse that we had seen a couple times, I think, in Derby preps earlier in the year. Although they had tried him on turf a couple times recently, I really think dirt's the best surface for him, and he got back on that surface here. And I thought he looked pretty good winning. He was wide on the turns, and he drew off in the stretch. Don't know what was behind him, but I just thought he looked good doing it.
Yeah, I would agree with that. His figure was nothing to get too excited about. He ran a 112 TimeformUS, but given the trip that he had, I think it puts him back on the right track. He had run some pretty big numbers in some of those preps, as you mentioned. I think he ran a 120 in the Shared Belief when he hit the board that day. So good to see him on the right path. I definitely agree that he's probably a better horse on dirt than he is on turf. He seems to be more effective on that surface, and curious to see what they do with him next. He definitely has some talent, but he will have to improve on that number to be a stakes horse.
Yeah, and this was another race I was watching that made me kind of think perhaps it wasn't that detrimental for this horse to be 4 wide around both turns. Typically, that would be a pretty tough trip on the dirt, but he didn't seem to be hindered by it. It might be that he was just so much the best in this race it didn't matter, but he certainly didn't seem to mind going wide around both turns. The runner-up Canadian Pride, he's a nice horse. I just think he ultimately wants to go a little bit shorter. He earned a big figure breaking his maiden in his prior start, but I think sprint distances would be in his future. Let's move over to the East Coast in New York, where they ran a few stakes races last weekend, and also some maiden and allowance races that we'll discuss a little bit later on. But I think the feature from the past weekend at Aqueduct was the Artie Schiller that was run on Saturday, this one going a mile on the turf. We talked about this race on the forecast last week. I know we were wondering how much pace would develop in this race, because it did seem like Rinaldi was the lone speed, but he actually got a little bit of pressure up front. They forced him to set at least an honest pace, and that allowed therapists to come from off the pace to get the job done here.
Yeah, the pace definitely wound up being pretty solid. Rinaldi got that clear lead as we expected, but he had to go pretty quick to do it. All the pace figures are 130 or higher, and he just didn't have enough left to hold on. And Therapist, just what a cool horse he is. He ran a 118 with the win, but he just has to be one of the most consistent horses in training. He basically runs within a few points of the same speed figure every single time out. He's always in the high teens, low 120s, somewhere in that area, and just really big effort from him. He was game all the way to the wire. It didn't look like he was going to be able to get up mid stretch, but he just kicked it into another gear and got the win pretty comfortably in the end. And I was surprised by the Valid Point performance. He actually got a 120 tracking that quick pace, and it was good to see him finally show some of that promise that he showed as a 3-year-old. I didn't like him at all in here. I preferred Delaware or the Chad Brown horses, but he seemed to have regained his best form for sure in this one. And looking back at this race, I said it on the forecast, it's more of a grade 3 type race than just listed, because these are some solid stakes horses in this field.
I thought Therapist helped to debunk the notion that he's a horse that can only win around one turn, because I've seen a lot of people say that about him and give that as a reason to knock him in races like this. And I think it's just people get too caught up in wins sometimes. And it is true that most of his wins did come around one turn early in his career when he was facing New York breds and weaker company. I mean, he is a New York bred, so we got to take advantage of those races early in his career. But I always say it's instructive to look at the speed figures, not so much look at the victories versus losses, because sometimes horses run a lot better in their losses against tougher company than they do in their wins against softer company. And if you look at Therapist's speed figures, he's actually run some of his best races around 2 turns or around those 1.5 turns that they do at Belmont, going a mile and a 16th. So Therapist just racked up another victory here. He's just a really honest horse. He's now at I think, almost $700,000, 5-year-old, and he's a gelding, so I assume they'll keep him in training next year. And it's always fun to see these New York breds stay in training and compete in those races like the West Point and the Mohawk. I mean, gone are the days when we used to see Lubash and King Creesa and Carafa battle in those races, but I think Therapist is now getting to that level.
Yeah, he definitely is. You certainly won't get any argument from me about you looking at speed figures to figure out what horses are best at. Because as you say, sometimes whether you win or lose has as much to do with the competition as your own preferences. And he's shown nothing that said he couldn't handle 2 turns to me.
The Chad Brown horses that were second and third here, Valid Point, I thought ran pretty well. He was the one that was pressing Rinaldi in the early going. And Delaware just seems like a little bit of a head case. He got 2 rank in the early going, had to steady off heels into the first turn, and he got there at the end and just couldn't quite seal the deal. He still seems like a little bit of a disappointment overall. He had his chance to win this race even after that trouble and couldn't quite get it done. But maybe Chad Brown will figure these 2 out eventually. On Sunday, sticking on turf, they ran the Winter Memories, this one for the 3-year-old fillies, and Chad Brown did get the money here with Duopoly, a filly who got to set a pretty moderate pace. We had kind of foreseen that ahead of time. We talked about this race on the forecast last week. There just wasn't a whole lot of pace on paper, and Irad Ortiz got to dictate terms on the front end, and nobody could really stick with her. It looked like she was going to be in some trouble at the top of the stretch, but those early fractions allowed her to kick away at the end.
Yeah, it was just a moderate pace. We had it pretty even throughout, and I thought it was a great ride by Irad Ortiz. He took it to him early, did just enough to get that clear lead, and saved enough for the finish. And she needed every bit of it because they were getting to her late. But just a good effort from Duopoly, about as expected. She is a 3-year-old. This race was for 3-year-olds, so they're kind of running out of chances with having to compete against the same age group. And she got a 112 TimeformUS speed figure for this win. These horses are definitely going to have to step it up come next year when they're going to have to face older, because 112s aren't going to do it, but they are fairly lightly raced, but they're 3-year-olds. They're still improving, so it's certainly possible.
Yeah, I thought the interesting horse maybe coming out of this race was the runner-up High Opinion, who looked like she was placed over her head coming off a maiden victory, and she was dismissed at 25-1 here, but she put in a big effort to be second. I mean, not only was she a little bit off that pace, but she was 3 wide around both turns, and she was the only one that was running on at the end. And you might remember, she's a horse that had broken her maiden for Tony Dutrow in her prior start at 97-1, and I think she proved that that was certainly no fluke, because she took a big step forward off that performance here, and she's one with all the upside that she still has that could be one that you want out of this race.
Yeah, she was certainly looked good. I knew she had won at big odds, but I forgot it was 97-1, and she was 25-1 in here and improved 15 points off that maiden win up to a 111, the second best figure in the field, and in only her third lifetime start. She certainly has some upside.
Now, on Saturday, the other stakes race that they ran was for the 2-year-old New York breds, the Notebook, going 6 furlongs, and I can't say that I've ever seen a race where 4 horses have all broken through the start before the race at once. I mean, Eagle Orb started this chain reaction, actually, but he left the gate and 3 other horses did as well, all before the starter hit the button and they had to be reloaded. It's just something you almost never see, but turns out the joke was on everybody else, because Eagle Orb didn't faze him at all and he won the race.
Yeah, he ran really well for the red-hot Rudy Rodriguez, who has found his best Aqueduct form. Seems to be where he does his best work. And this was a big effort on the turn back for him. It was a race where I thought maybe some of the others who were lately raced could jump up and catch the top 2 in the, well, actually, I'm not even sure Eagle Orb wound up the second choice, which was pretty surprising in its own right that he went off at 5-1. I was totally with your morning line, but sometimes the betting just goes in weird directions. But I thought he ran a big race. He ran what he's been running. He ran a 99 last time. He upped it to 100 this time. Blue Gator almost matched his figure that he ran at Finger Lakes. He ran a 99 there and a 97 here. And then it was a big gap to the rest. They improved the third and fourth finishers, but not nearly enough to make a dent on those. And I mean, I think it's pretty clear the best horse won here. It's hard to see a scenario where if they ran this race back next week, Eagle Orb was just much the best for me.
Yeah, as you said, Rudy Rodriguez, his runners have just been really firing so far at this Aqueduct meet. You might remember he was in quite a slump when Belmont first started, and that kind of corresponds to Eagle Orb's career record, because his one poor performance was in early October at Belmont. Kind of inexplicably, he ran badly that day, but his other 4 races have all been solid, and this was arguably his best yet, turning back in distance. The pace of this race was a little surprising, because it seemed like there was a lot of speed on paper, but as we so often see in New York, there were just a lot of tentative rides coming out of the gate. I don't know if that had something to do with the fact that so many horses had broken through prior to the start. But I mean, Storm Shooter, who was the very surprising second choice in this race at 9-2. I mean, it seems like these myracehorse.com horses just get bet blindly by their many owners. But that horse got to the front end, and I don't know what Jose Ortiz was thinking. He slowed the pace down so much to the point that he just dragged this horse back to last place. I didn't really know what was going on there, but it kind of messed up the trips for all the horses in behind. But Eagle Orb was outside of all of that, and he got the clear run and just kind of strutted his stuff to victory. But some weird trips due to the fact that the pace was so slow.
Yeah, I guess that's something you're going to have to keep in mind when making morning lines for the My Racehorse stable horses, because I didn't even think of that, but that's the only explanation I could think for that horse getting bet more than Eagle Orb, because the PP certainly didn't justify it.
No, it's actually something I've already started doing, because I've noticed that trend quite a few times with a couple of horses that they have, including this one. Moving on to some other non-stakes action from Aqueduct last week. On Friday, we saw a couple of allowance races, one sprinting and one going longer. 6.5 furlongs, the nominators of one allowance race. That was the 7th race on that card. We saw a pretty promising 3-year-old for Kelly Breen, Full Impact. This is a horse who had won his debut at Monmouth, going 6 furlongs against a suspect field, but looked good doing it. But he stepped up here and I thought looked pretty good. This is a horse who he was helped by some scratches in this race, because there was one horse in particular that looked like he was going to be a big favorite to dare for Neil Drysdale. But given what was left in the field, I mean, he did what he was supposed to do and beat them soundly.
Yeah, I mean, he looked good to me. He's now 2 for 2, 2 easy wins. He improved his TimeformUS speed figure from 100 first out to a 110. Now, that debut was knocked down a bit because of pace, but his final time figure even improved 5 points from a 108 to a 113. So he's certainly a promising 3-year-old. I like the fact that while he was right on the lead, he did face a little pressure from War Toxin early in the race. Didn't seem to phase him very much. And as you said, it wasn't the strongest group, but he did everything right. He's lightly raced, so there's certainly some upside with this one.
Now, as you said, he is one of these horses that got downgraded for a slow pace in this race, and that half-mile fraction is color-coded blue. But what I like, at least in this situation, is that he did run a fast opening quarter, and he had some company for that as War Toxin was kind of aggressively sent to get the lead by Irad Ortiz, and they slowed the pace down midway, and then he picked up the pace again for the stretch drive. And in these slow pace races, I at least like to see that, where a horse shows that he has multiple gears, he can show that early speed, back off, and then finish the race. And that gives me a little bit of hope for this horse stretching out in distance, because he does have a pedigree to stretch out. His dam was a pretty good dirt router, and he's by street sense, so there should be no reason why he can't go longer distances. And I just think they're bringing him along the right way, so I'm intrigued to see where they go with him from here. And that other allowance race that I mentioned took place one race after on Friday. And I should mention, there was a lot of rain in the New York area on Thursday and Friday, so the track was sloppy for both of these races. But this 8th race was actually an off-the-turf affair, and luckily there were plenty of main track onlys entered, so it really was basically a dirt race. And Backside of the Moon, who was one of those MTOs, got the job done over the very gay Musical Heart. Just a cool battle for these two old-timers, and Backside of the Moon, who's 8 years old now, just seems to keep cranking out these solid performances.
Yeah, and he was another Rudy Rodriguez, first off the claim. I think he was a reclaim. I think he had him 4 or 5 races back and thought enough to take him back and took full advantage of this off the turf. He's just one of, as you said, one of the cooler horses. He reminds me a lot of Therapist, consistency-wise, in that he just always seems to run the same number within a few points, no matter what kind of competition he's in against, good or bad. He always comes up with one of his better performances. So just a really cool horse I like. I do think he was a little bit favored by the trip. His Musical Heart was up close to a pretty quick pace, so he got a little higher speed figure. But, on the other hand, Backside of the Moon was only a length behind him or so throughout the race. So just a really good effort from those two. And, I mean, these are solid numbers for allowance horses. Not too far off a stakes competition. I don't know if at this point in their career that's something that's in the cards, but they're certainly going to make plenty of money for their owners with these kind of numbers.
Yeah, Backside of the Moon's just a personal favorite for me. I was a big fan of his when he started out his career in Leo O'Brien's barn. He won a few races for him, but, I mean, he stepped his game up a little bit for Rudy Rodriguez. I mean, Leo got some similar performances out of him early on, but he's just held his form for so long. As you said, he just runs these speed figures. Sometimes they place him over his head, and those numbers in the 1-teens are not good enough to win stakes races, but when he gets in against the right field, he can still get it done. And I also want to mention Manny Franco. He made this horse finish off the race, because Backside of the Moon, he can be a horse that has a tendency to hang a little bit at the end of his races, especially going 1 1/8, because 1 1/8 sometimes is a little bit long for him. But, say what you will about Manny Franco and him as a tactical rider, but I think he's one of the strongest finishers in the game. He just really gets the best out of a horse in the final 16th of a mile, especially when you're in a duel with another one.
Yeah,
he got this horse to finish up.
Yeah, I remember watching that race live and just thinking, man, he's got to be exhausted after that one, because he rode him hard for a long time.
Let's finish up the Aqueduct action with a race from Saturday. This was a maiden special weight for the 2-year-olds going 7 furlongs. And I remember when I first did the morning line for this race, I was kind of saying to myself, there are a lot of pedigrees in this race, a lot of quality horses, some intriguing first-time starters. This will probably be a race that we are talking about for months to come, because there could be a number of talented horses coming out of here. And while a well-bred firster did win this race, I don't think it was the one that many people expected.
No, for sure not. Wolfie's Dynaghost came out of Tom Albertrani barn, which is not one known for winning very often first time out. But I don't know if the connections were surprised or if they knew what they had. But at 33-1, I don't think it was any fluke that this horse won. He looked very impressive. And overall, I think this is going to be a pretty strong race. Wayburn, who ran second, actually got a 98 TimeformUS speed figure. He showed that typical improvement for Jimmy Jerkin second time out, which is just something like clockwork with him. You can almost count on his horses running a much better race second time. So, and even the third finisher, Kid Cash, I thought ran a big race. And I just think this is going to be a really promising group going forward and a race to keep an eye on.
Yeah, Wolfie's Dynaghost, the winner. He is the younger half-brother to Sadler's Joy, so kind of surprising to see him win his debut, going 7 furlongs on the dirt. But sometimes these horses take more after the sires than they do the dams, and the dam side is all turf route with this horse. It's not just Sadler's Joy. All the siblings have been best going along on the turf, but he's by Ghost Sapper, and maybe he just takes more after that sire line, as he was pretty precocious winning this race. There were some trips in behind and some horses with pedigrees that seemed a little green. I think this is a race that I'm going to do on my Horses to Watch segment this week, which I'll record tomorrow, just to talk about a couple of the horses that had trips in behind. But I agree, this is a race that I think you might want to look for some trips and follow horses moving forward.
And is this the race where Dynamic One was left at the gate, or just didn't break?
He was the Todd Pletcher first tree that was really bad, and he was just off extremely slowly.
Right, that's so yeah, I'll look forward to that one. I always watch your shows, as I've told you, and I even brought one of my best friends from high school on board. I told you about offline, so he's going to quiz me if I don't watch him, so I have to now.
I appreciate that. Yeah, it's one of the segments I really enjoy doing, because it's kind of going through my own handicapping process, looking for those horses that you do want to bet back. And we're actually going to talk about a horse that I highlighted on my previous Horses to Watch segment when we do these Churchill races. We'll get to that in a little bit, though. The stakes race at Churchill Downs last week was the Mrs. Revere, originally a grade 2, but downgraded to a grade 3 once it was taken off the turf. And I know they're having some problems with their turf course at Churchill Downs, so I think they're going to be off the turf for the next 2 weeks there. It was just kind of a guessing game as to which of these turf fillies were going to handle the dirt. And Princess Grace, she was the one that was able to do it best. I don't think we'll see her in dirt races moving forward off this performance, but she got the job done over some fellow turf horses here.
Yeah, I don't have too much to add to this. She ran a 97 for the win. She was the best of what was left in the race. Not a strong performance at all. I definitely agree with the downgrade. I mean, these are horses who have been running 110s or so on the turf. So to not be able to hit 3 digits just tells me that they are indeed turf horses. So hopefully they can find better spots than on the dirt, because I'd be against any of these if they showed up on dirt. But I doubt that's going to happen.
Yeah, I think they'll all wind up back on turf in the future. And I mean, Princess Grace was a horse that I was very interested in on the turf. And I mean, I don't think this performance moves her up or moves her down in my estimation. It just kind of doesn't matter that much. But I'm still looking forward to seeing what she does when she gets back on the turf, because I did think she ran very well given that fast-paced situation in the Valley View at Keeneland. And we saw Duopoly come back after being involved in that fast pace, and she won the Winter Memories. So I'd like to see what she can do getting back on the turf. And it's funny, I was looking up her pedigree, seeing if there was anything that I liked in this race for dirt, and she's kind of got an anomalous pedigree, at least for what we see in the U.S., in that she's inbred pretty closely to Sunday Silence, and obviously Sunday Silence was imported to Japan, and it's common to see horses inbred to Sunday Silence overseas, but not so much in the U.S. It's kind of just an influence we don't see that much. So she's kind of got a pedigree that you don't often get to see run in the United States.
Someday I'm going to get you offline and have you teach me about all that stuff.
A lot of people know more than I do, and to me it's just kind of fascinating to look up these horses and see if I can recognize who's in their bloodlines. Moving on to the Churchill Downs action from last week, yet another off-the-turf race we saw on Friday. This one was, I think, the 9th race on the card. Ramsey Solution for Wesley Ward. He's a horse that had previously won on both turf and synthetic and run well on both of those surfaces, and now he's added dirt to his repertoire as he was able to get the job done against this field of mostly turf horses. I think, though, being able to set a moderate pace helped him get the job done.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of cool. He's been able to win on all three surfaces. We don't see that as often as we used to with so few synthetic surfaces left out there for now. But it was a solid enough effort, but typical off the turf race for me in that he only ran a 110. I think he's clearly better on the turf. He's a horse who's been able to run 120s before. He set a very moderate pace, not enough to be coded in blue, but every pace figure was a little bit quicker than the one before it, so everything kind of went his way. He wound up with a 110 overall, 112 final time, so nothing for me to get too excited about. But when he shows back up on turf, I'll certainly consider that he's still in good form based on this win.
And finishing things up at Churchill Downs with a maiden race from Sunday. This one was going a mile for the 2-year-olds. And this is the horse that I had mentioned. I had been interested in betting back Caddo River off his previous race at Belmont, though wasn't really interested in betting him at 1-5 in this race. I wasn't anticipating that he'd wind up in the field where he was such a standout. But I still think he ran exceptionally well to win this race, stretching out in distance, setting on his pace, and he just kept going.
Yeah, this was an impressive effort. He certainly had no problems handling that mile distance, and he just looked really good doing it. He wound up with a 107 TimeformUS speed figure. He had actually run a 109 when he was runner-up last time out at, I think that was at Belmont, if memory serves, and just a real big effort from him. There was another, I guess it was a split maiden race. The 5th race on the card was also a 2-year-old maiden race around that 1-turn mile. And Santa Cruiser, who's also a promising horse, was able to win that one. But this horse was just much faster. He was more than a half second faster. So that's how he wound up with a 107 compared to Santa Cruiser's only 100. But I thought both of those races were pretty strong. But this horse looks like he has all kind of upside for Brad Cox.
Yeah, he just did this easily. I mean, Florent Geroux never really even asked him for his best. He's just got so much natural speed, and he was able to carry at a distance. We'll see if the 2 turns hinders him, but he's certainly bred to go that far. He's by Hardspun, his dam Pangburn. I believe she was a stakes-winning dirt router around 2 turns, so I'm not really anticipating more distance hindering him. And you're right, he was coming out of a maiden race at Belmont, where I thought he ran extremely well given the pace of that race. He got a big pace upgrade. That was the race that was won by that highly touted Bill Mott horse, Speaker's Corner. We saw another horse out of there, Greatest Honor, come back and just barely lose at Aqueduct, I think 2 weeks ago with an improved speed figure. So that seems like a strong maiden race that he's coming out of, and got the job done here. And I imagine they'll move him up to stakes company next time.
Yeah, I'll admit that was a figure I was a little worried about when I saw that 109. But when you look back at the chart in the race, it seems legit, particularly with his win. And even the last place finisher, albeit on turf, a horse named Original came back to win. So definitely a race to keep an eye on. And that's something that happens when we get these races with strong paces like that one, because you can't hide in those races. There's not a lot of doubting that it was a good race, and horses have to run a bit. Sometimes with the slow paces, we don't really know what they're going to do when the pace is quick. But when you get these red fractions, we kind of know because they get exposed for how good they aren't at that point in time.
Well, that's all the racing to recap this week. We will continue on the same schedule, doing the Pacecast on Tuesday and the forecast on Friday for the foreseeable future. And on this Friday's forecast, we'll again look to do a little potpourri of racing from around the country. I think we've got the Red Smith taking place at Aqueduct on Saturday. They're running the Chaluki at Churchill Downs and the Native Diver going 1.1 miles at Del Mar. So we'll see if those races look interesting to talk about. We can handicap those and maybe some others from around the country. I think there are also some races up at Woodbine this weekend. So we'll see what there is, what looks interesting, and Craig, we'll find some races to handicap for this Friday's show.
Oh, for sure. It's always, I don't know if that Native Diver is going to be one. There's only 5 horses in it, but we'll definitely find a few out there, and maybe even journey north to Canada. That's always fun.
Well, remember, you can always listen to both of these podcasts on DRF.com, Spotify, iTunes, YouTube, and SoundCloud. Wherever you get your podcast, just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Thanks for tuning in this week, and we'll be back with the TimeformUS forecast on Friday.